This video is about obligations with subtopic general provisions. So for general provisions, we're going to discuss the definition of obligations. Second is we're going to discuss also the elements of an obligation, and last are the sources of obligations. So this is according to your 2020-2021 bar exam coverage. So pinaturn ko lang to doon sa bar exam coverage nyo as published by the Supreme Court. So we'll go to the definition of obligation. So according to Article 1156, an obligation is a juridical necessity to give, to do, or not to do. Take note of the word juridical necessity. Kaya yan may highlight because Article 1156 talks about civil obligation. So diretso, what is the difference between civil obligation and natural obligation? Of course, first, your civil obligation, the applicable article is Article 1156. Kababasa pa lang natin. Whereas your natural obligation, the applicable articles are Articles 1423 to 1430. How about the basis? What is the basis of civil obligation? The basis is your positive law. Yung natural obligation, the basis of that is natural law and equity. And if you talk about civil obligation, you can enforce that in court. So, pwede kang mag-file ng case. Whereas in your natural obligation, you cannot enforce that in court. Also, take note of the terms to give, 1. Number 2 is to do. Second, and last is not to do. Ano-ano ba yan? That is your prestation or the object of obligation. Later on, in the following slide, we will talk about the elements of obligation. Ito guys, before we proceed to the next slides. As early as now, you study civil law. The reason for that is, number 1, it is 15% of your bar examinations. 15% yan. Number 2, ang problema sa civil law is not really the difficulty. Maririnig nyo to sa mga reviewers. It's not really the difficulty of the subject, but the length. Yung coverage niya masyadong madami, masyadong mahaba. Kaya nagiging mahirap yung civil law. Also, another tip that I can give you, when you study civil law, ang style dito, diskarte. Didiskartehan mo siya. So, hindi kasi pwedeng minaster mo si family code, minaster mo si succession, minaster mo si sales, pero pinabayaan mo naman yung ibang topics, like for example, yung prescription, yung trust, yung possession. Kasi sa civil law, siguro maswerte na like an examiner would be asking 3 questions coming from the topic ng succession, coming from family code. The rest, kukunin niya na yung mga paisa-isa is kukunin niya na doon sa ibang topics. Kasi ang dami pwedeng pagpipilian eh. So, dapat talaga sa civil law, diskarte. So, you focused on the favorite topics na tinatackle sa bar exams. This is the reason why, for the next slides, ang dami kong pinasok na mga bar exam questions para alam nyo kung ano yung mga favorite topic or usually asked in the like for example in obligations or the favorite topic of your examiners in civil law. So here is a 1977 bar exam question. What are natural obligations, and give an example. So napaka-simple lang ng tanong, no? Pero pag nandun ka na sa bar exams, alam mo, ito yung mga questions na hirap kang sagutin. Kasi basic to, at sa sobrang dami ng naaral mo, parang hindi mo na alam kung paano siya sasagutin. Kaya, take note of the keywords. Ang keywords, if you talk about natural obligations, is the basis, which is equity and natural law. And second is, it is not enforceable in court action. Pag sinulat mo yan, may point ka na dun. Maaring hindi siya full point, pero hindi ka din naman i-zero. Kaya, take note of the keywords. Another bar exam question. Favorite topic tong civil obligation as opposed to natural obligation. Look, it was asked in 2004. It was also asked in 1989. So distinguish briefly but clearly between civil obligation and natural obligation. How is a civil obligation distinguished from natural obligation? Give an example of a natural obligation. Yan, dyan ka. So, ano yung mga example ng natural obligations? I have here, I saw this memory aid ng Ateneo. Mahaba kasi pag sinulat mo yung mga provisions ng civil code mismo. Pero ito yung simplified na sinulat ng Ateneo memory aid. The examples of natural obligations enumerated under the civil code are: number 1, if you are going to perform the civil after the civil obligation has prescribed, if you are going to reimburse a third person for a debt that has prescribed, if there is a restitution by minor after annulment of contract, if there is delivery by minor of money or fungible thing in fulfillment of obligation, and number 5 is if there is a performance after action to enforce civil obligation has failed. Number 6 is if there is payment by heir of the debt exceeding the value of property inherited, and last is the payment of legacy after will have been declared void. Binasa ko lang muna siya. Discussions will be in another video if we are going to talk about natural obligations. So, just to emphasize na favorite topic ang civil and natural obligations, it was asked again in 2015, distinguished civil and natural obligations. Also, in 2011 sa MCQ, yan, by this time siguro alam nyo na kung paano siya sagutin. A natural obligation under the new Civil Code of the Philippines is one which, ang sagot dito is letter D. You cannot enforce it in court but authorizes the obligee to retain the obligor's payment or performance. That is your natural obligation. So, we're going to talk about the elements of an obligation. So, number 1 is your passive subject, otherwise known as the debtor or the obligor, from whom the obligation is juridically demandable. The second is your active subject, the creditor or the obligee. This is the person who can demand the fulfillment of the obligation. So, pag nalito kayo, sino nga ba yung active subject? Sino nga ba yun? So, take note, the demonic is AC. AC or aircon. Tandaan nyo, aircon. A is for your active subject. C is for your creditor. So, your creditor is your active subject. So, the creditor is the one or the person who can demand the fulfillment of the obligation. Third element is your vinculum juris or your legal tie. This is which binds the parties to the obligation and which may arise from the bilateral or the unilateral acts of persons or persons. And last is your object or the subject matter. Ito, tinakil na natin to, which is the fact, the prestation, or the service. Take note that in object, it must be licit or legal, and it must be possible and determinate or determinable, and must have pecuniary value. So I have here a 2012 bar question, MCQ. What are the elements, or the following are the elements of an obligation except letter A is juridical or legal tie, active subject, the passive subject, and last is the consideration. So what is your guess, or what is the correct answer? That's letter D. Ang consideration is not an element of an obligation. Another MCQ, 2012, again, it is a conduct that may consist of giving, doing, or not doing something. The choices are obligation, juridical necessity, prestation, contract. Sinabi ko na yan. So, the correct answer there is correct. That's letter C. So, di ba I told you to take note of the terms to give, to do, or not to do, because that is the prestation of an obligation. So, this is the end of the part 1 of the general provisions of obligation. So, please watch out for the part 2 where we are going to talk about the sources of obligations. Thank you very much and good day.